For 20 years, the aroma of wood and sawdust has been the only gospel I have believed in. It is honest. You cut the wood, sand it, and then join it. It becomes whatever you make it. There are rules. There is a grain to follow. There is truth in the stuff that cannot be lied out of. People are not like that. People are all knots and rot disguised behind a lovely facade. I was working on a rocking chair, running a piece of 220 grit sandpaper along the curve of an armrest. The movements were automatic, imprinted on my muscle memory after thousands of repetitions. Back and forth. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light that filtered the dirty windows of my studio. This was my haven, a 10 by 20 foot box of quiet control amid a life that had spun out of control 2 decades earlier and never quite found its center again. The photograph sat on a shelf, and next to a jar of rusty screws and a stack of old invoices. The colors have faded over the course of 20 summers. Me at 18, with lanky arms and a naive, hopeful grin. Lucas, my 14-year-old brother, already has the attractive, camera-ready smile that will one day sell million-dollar homes. And Chloe, 16, jammed between us, poking her tongue out, her eyes brimming with the reckless delight that the world can't wait to extinguish. The ghost. My ghost. My phone buzzed against the workbench, making a scratchy, obtrusive noise amid the quiet hum of the shop. The screen lit up with Lucas. Of course, I let it vibrate a few more times, a small, petty act of resistance before wiping my filth palms on my pants and lifting it. "Hey," I said. My voice was scratchy from DeZeus. "Hey, Mark, just checking in. How are things?" His voice was slick and polished like a man who says just checking in, but really means, "I'm making sure the family liability is still contained." The usual quiet, I said. As usual, a life stripped down to its minimal necessities. Work, eat, and sleep. Avoid using mirrors. Avoid old photos. Fail to avoid old photos. Listen, I'm heading over to Mom's old house later to sort through some things. He told me. The house was now his. Everything was his. Figured I'd swing by, maybe bring some pizza. Like old times. There were no old times. There was before and after. We hadn't talked about it before. "Yeah, okay," I heard myself reply. "See you then." He was the bridge, the one who made the calls, organized the awkward holiday dinners when Mom was still alive, and kept up the weak veneer of family. I let him since the alternative was an island of complete silence, something even I wasn't prepared for. Or so I thought. I hung up and the silence returned, this time with greater intensity. My gaze shifted back to the photograph. Clue. For 20 years, I had lived with her ghost, as well as the spirit of the man I was supposed to be before becoming the town's tragedy, the brother who fled the disaster. Lucas was all I had left from that existence. I trusted him. That was my first error. My final one was thinking I didn't have anything to lose. The lawyer's office reeked of old paper, lemon polish, and quiet money. It was a smothering odor, the type that clings to terrible news. I felt like a stray dog that had stumbled into a showroom, with my basic work shirt and old jeans standing out against the mahogany and leather. Lucas, next to me, looked like he was born in his tailored suit. He donned a mask of somber mourning, which I'm sure he practiced in the mirror. He was good with masks. Mr. Henderson, our family's lawyer since I can remember, was a guy of dry coughs and rustling papers. He adjusted his glasses on his beak-like nose, staring at me with pity that made my skin crawl. "We're here to read Eleanor Davis' last will and testament," he said, his voice dry and monotone. "It's quite straightforward." He cleared his throat and began reading. "I bequeath all my worldly possessions, including the family home located at 45 Elm Street, all savings, investments, and personal effects to my son, Lucas Davis." I did not flinch. I expected it. Mom had made her decision long ago. Lucas, ever the performance, bent his head in modest appreciation. I could feel his sideways scrutiny, assessing my reaction. I gave him nothing. Stone. That's what they had turned me into. Then Henderson hesitated. He squirmed awkwardly in his high back leather chair, averting my gaze. This was it. He was dreading this part. "There is one final clause." He took a breath and read the words that would break the silence of the previous 20 years. "As for my son, Mark Davis, I leave him nothing. May God forgive him for the death of my daughter, Chloe, for I never could." The words did not simply hang in the air. They crystallized, serving as a monument to a lifetime of judgment. It wasn't simply disinheritance. It was the ultimate public branding. 20 years of cold shoulders, forgotten birthdays, and conversations that ceased as I entered a room, all condensed into one single, venomous sentence. My mother's final words to me were delivered by a stranger in a stuffy room. The blood raced to my face in a torrent of shame and wrath. It was not about the money. It was about the falsehood being recorded in history, legally notarized and filed away. Lucas placed his hand on my shoulder in an act of fake sympathy. "Mark, I'm so sorry," he muttered. "I had no idea." "Liar." I rose up, my chair's legs scraping across the glossy floor. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I went out of that office, past the concerned-looking secretary, and into the bright, unconcerned sunshine, a convicted man punished for a crime that everyone, including myself, believed I committed. My apartment was a place to exist, not a home. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a window looking out onto a brick wall. That night, it became a tomb. The half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey on the table was my sole friend. I sat in the dark, the lawyer's words reverberating between my ears. May God forgive him. I never could. She never could. She had not glanced at me while I was in the hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. Her gaze was locked on a point on the wall behind me. She'd questioned the doctor right in front of me. Will he be able to stand trial? And then the hush began. It was a dense, suffocating blanket. We lived in the same house for 2 more years until I was 20 and moved out. But we never talked about that night again. She had buried 1 kid in the earth and another in quiet. The whiskey burned down my throat, but it couldn't reach the cold, tight knot of grief in my chest. I feel bad for Chloe. I'm grieving for my mother, who died the same night, and I feel bitter, deep sadness for myself. I had attempted to gain her forgiveness. For 20 years, every finely constructed dovetail joint and immaculately finished piece of furniture served as a subtle plea. I am not a monster. I'm careful. I am exact. I am not the reckless boy who killed your daughter. But it wasn't enough. The will was not only a final rejection, it was an erasure. It announced to the world that I was not her son. I was her burden, the person who killed her. I had reached the very bottom. My life's foundation, built on shifting sands of shame and desperate hope for redemption, had just been swept away. There was nothing below me anymore, only a chilly, dark nothingness. And in that void, something new and dreadful began to emerge. The transformation began with a whisper, not a shout. Intoxicated, urgent want-to-cleans, I fumbled through my modest apartment, tossing stuff away. Old clothes, faded periodicals, and junk mail. I was attempting to throw aside the burden of my own life. A dusty cardboard box lay in the back of my closet, hidden beneath a mound of old blankets. My high school years. Yearbooks I never glanced through, old jerseys, and a few useless items. My fingertips brushed against a thick manila packet. The label, printed in a police officer's blocky script, read, "Accident Report Case of 78B4. They had handed it to me in the hospital. While my mind was still spinning, a cop with sleepy eyes pointed to where I needed to sign. I placed it into a box and never looked at it again. Why should I? I knew what had happened. I was there. I was the driver. But tonight was different. The anguish had faded away, leaving behind a cold, sterile emptiness. There was nothing left to fear or lose. My hands were unusually steady as I loosened the rope and opened the folder. The following several days were a flurry of transformation. The rocking chair was removed from my workshop. Instead, I tacked up the first page of the accident report. The workshop, my creative space, gradually transformed into a battle room. I went to the library and retrieved the microfiche of the local newspaper from that week. I printed the grainy black and white images of the crash scene, which showed my father's crumpled Ford Taurus twisted around the ancient oak on Elm Street, the skid lines like black wounds on the pavement. I made a diagram of the road, automobile, and tree. I read my own statement, which came from an 18-year-old lad who had been concussed and traumatized. "A deer," I had stated. It jumped out, he swerved. Then I read Lucas's statement, written by a horrified 14-year-old. It was dark. I saw the deer. Mark swerved. Everything was there. A lovely and terrible short narrative, the official story, the story that had shaped my life. But I wasn't that boy anymore. I was an artisan. I saw the world in degrees, dimensions, and the small nuances that distinguish a perfect fit from a sloppy joint. I examined the images of the skid marks with a cool, scientific stare, not the eyes of a grieving brother. And that's when I noticed it, the inconsistency, a fault in the design. The official story was that I swerved to avoid a deer. I said quiet the empty workshop, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. That's what I said. That's what Lucas confirmed. But the skid marks told a different story. I pinned a close-up photo to the board. 2 black lines. The initial curve was lengthy and gradual. That was my swerve. That was me, reacting to the deer and moving the wheel to the left. But there was a second mark, a sharp and forceful jag to the right. It was not a correction. It was overly aggressive and quick. It indicated that the car was being jerked rather than steered, a force applied from within the automobile. I closed my eyes, pushed through the wall of trauma I had created around that memory, and forced myself back into the passenger seat of that car for the first time in 20 years. The scent of cheap air freshener, the sound of Clue's favorite band on the radio, and yelling. They were fighting. Clue and Lucas. A ridiculous, juvenile argument. "You took it! I saw you!" Chloe's voice ran high and outraged. "Did not! You can't prove it!" Lucas said, his voice crackling with adolescent outrage. "I'm telling Mom you stole her $50. Shut up! Both of you! Just shut up!" I screamed, my gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. Then there was a flash of brown and white at the edge of the headlight. The deer. I swerved. The tires screeched. There was a second scream. Clues. Not for fear of the deer. She yelled at Lucas. He reached across the seat. His hand. I opened my eyes. The workshop was completely silent. A single, horrible, crystal clear notion arose from the wilderness of my consciousness. He grabbed the wheel. He grabbed the wheel. He yanked it in a fit of immature wrath, an overreaction to a silly quarrel about $50, and that yank propelled us into the oak tree. That yank killed our sister. In that frigid, silent moment, my plan came together. It would not be a call to the police. What was my word against his 20 years later? A reclaimed memory from a bitter, disinherited alcoholic? No. The court system had already failed me. My justice needed to be personal. It needed to be precise. It needed to be constructed. Lucas had hijacked my family, identity, and life and built his own beautiful world on top of that lie. I was not about to wreck his universe. That was overly basic. I was going to offer him the truth. I was going to make him accept it, live with it, and let it poison him from within, just like it had done to me. My phone rang, interrupting the silence. Lucas. I took a deep, steadying breath, put a dusty tarp over my evidence board, and slipped back into the broken brother mask. It fits a little tighter now. Hello. I made sure my voice was harsh and filled with false sadness. Mark. Thank God. I've been worried sick. You weren't answering. Are you okay? The compassion in his voice was so flawless and professional. It was nauseating. I'm fine. Just needed some time. Of course. Listen, whatever you need. I'm here for you. I'm your brother. The sheer, astounding chutzpah of it sent shivers down my spine. But when I responded, I kept my voice cool. The bait was ready. The trap was laid. I know, I replied. I know you are. The family home felt like a museum exhibit called The Lie. Everything was exactly as Mom had left it, meticulously kept and suffocatingly immaculate. Dustless surfaces represented a life that was scrupulously kept on the exterior while hollowed out on the inside. Lucas strode across it with the ease of a lord assessing his property. He was already discussing contractors, opening up the kitchen, and how much the property value had risen. He brought me a glass of water, his expression a picture of brotherly care. It's strange being here without her. He added, motioning around the living room. I was thinking of selling. A new family should be living here, making new memories. I paused for a moment before speaking. Before you do anything, I need to understand something. I spoke quietly and calmly. I dug inside my jacket's inner pocket and pulled out the folded, photocopied pages of the accident report. I put them on the polished coffee table between us. About that night, Lucas peered at the papers, a confused expression on his flawless features. Mark, what is this? Why are you doing this to yourself? It was a tragedy. It's over. Was it? I asked, my gaze fixed on his. I keep thinking about the fight. You and Kahlo in the back seat. About Mom's $50. His posture tensed. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. His shoulders stiffened a fraction of an inch from their relaxed position. The trap had been sprung. Aggie don't remember that. He muttered, his charm fraying. You must be confused. The shock you had a major concussion. My shock has subsided, Lucas. I leaned forward, my voice lowering to a low, frigid whisper. For the first time in 20 years, everything is crystal clear. I see the skid marks. I see the angle of the second swerve. I remember the argument. I stopped, allowing each word to hit like a hammer blow. I swerved, yes, but you were the one who jerked the wheel. You were the one who sent us into that tree. The Caring brother's mask shattered rather than simply cracking. His face went through a sequence of emotions: confusion, denial, and sheer naked dread. His skin turned pallid. "That's insane!" he exclaimed, his voice suddenly loud. "You're grieving, not thinking straight! You're trying to blame me for blame you! I interrupted him?" My voice rising, ice cold and sharp as a chisel. "You let me take the blame. You stood by for 20 years and watched me become the family pariah. You let me live in a prison of guilt while you played the perfect, grieving son. You let Mom hate me. You stood there in that lawyer's office and watched her spit on my grave from the great beyond. For what? For this house. For this money. Was it worth it, Lucas?" That was it. The final blow. He crumpled. Not in a cinematic, dramatic collapse, but in a pitiful, whimpering heap. The tears on his face were not for Chloe, myself, or our mother. They were for himself. Pure, blatant self-pity. "I was a kid!" he cried, his words strangled and harsh. "I was scared. I didn't mean for her to die. It was an accident. I didn't know what to do. You were the one driving." I just observed him, the spectacle of his total moral breakdown. There was no catharsis or fulfillment. Just a great, hollow sympathy for the weak, cowardly monster on the floor who bore my brother's face. "And you've been a kid ever since," I remarked, my tone flat. "Hiding behind me, hiding behind Mom. Always letting someone else take the weight." I stood up. The confrontation was over. The truth was out there in the clean, quiet living room between us. "The house is yours, Lucas," I stated, my voice devoid of passion. "The money is yours. And now the truth is yours, too. Live with it." I turned away from him and walked out the front door. I ignored the sound of his hoarse tears. I left him there, drowning in the inheritance he had so carefully nurtured, like a monarch in a castle made of bones. He had everything he ever desired, and suddenly he had nothing at all. He was free to dwell in the jail he'd created for me, but it was equipped with fine antiques and a truth that would never let him go. A few weeks later, I was back at my workshop. The evidence board had been removed and replaced by a new cabinet made of smooth, unfinished wood. My shoulders felt lighter now. I didn't feel delight, but rather profound quiet. The blazing fire of shame that had kept me going for 2 decades had been smothered. In its stead was a cool, clean, and empty space. But that was my space. I was finally free. Lucas had tried calling several times. I never responded. He sent a check, a sad attempt to purchase absolution. I tore it up without considering the amount. I was gathering the last of my mother's belongings, a small box of photos and letters Lucas had left on my doorway without a word, when I saw it. A single, sealed envelope sat at the bottom, beneath images of chubby, cheeked babies and awful school portraits. My name appeared on the front, scrawled in my mother's wobbly, aged hand. Mark. My heart pounded against my ribcage. With shaky fingers, I ripped it open. Inside, there was a solitary sheet of stationery. The letter began, "My dearest Mark," with her voice ringing in my ears, not the cold, distant voice of my memories, but one that was warm and filled with tremendous grief. If you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come out, just as I dreaded. I've known about Lucas since that night. He entered my room, drenched in muck and tears, and confessed everything. The words struck me like a physical blow. A vision rushed into my mind of a 14-year-old Lucas, frantic, being consoled by our mother in her bedroom as I was placed into an ambulance. I had assumed he was just terrified. "He was my baby," she wrote, "my weakest one. And you were always so strong. I made a terrible decision, one that no mother should have to make. I decided to protect the son I thought couldn't handle the truth over the son I thought could take anything. The will wasn't punishment, my love. It was my final, desperate, and broken attempt to protect you both. I gave him the money because he is worthless without it. I gave you nothing because I knew, and always knew, that you were capable of creating a world for yourself. It was my final and flawed act as a mother, a selfish and cowardly deed. Will you ever forgive me?" A solitary tear traced a clear route over the sawdust on my cheek. It was not a tear of rage. It was a tear of sorrowful, terrible comprehension. The entire, awful architecture of our family's downfall was exposed. It was not a story about good versus evil. It was a narrative of vulnerability, anxiety, and a mother's misplaced, stifling love. She had attempted to save both of her sons and, in doing so, condemned us all. I stared out the workshop window at the fading sun, holding the letter in my hand. They say that revenge is best served cold. But this was not vengeance. It was an excavation, digging through 2 decades of lies to uncover a hidden truth. My brother is now imprisoned by his secret, trapped in a golden cage of his own design. My mother was imprisoned by hers until the very end, and I'm finally free.